At 3 o'clock in the morning, 17 police cars surrounded my home. My daughter, Carol, had planted false evidence in my late husband's bedroom and told them I'd lost my mind. But what she didn't know was that an old librarian always knows how to find the truth. A phone call at 3 in the morning is never good news. And on that particular night, it felt like a death sentence. On the other end of the line, my grandson Wade's voice was fractured and panicked. "Grandma," he choked out, the words tumbling over each other. "Please, whatever you do, don't come home." It had only been a few hours since my own daughter, Carol, had pinned me to the arm of my favorite chair, her fingers digging into my flesh. And now 17 police cars were descending upon the quiet, tree-lined street where my husband and I had built a life. They were surrounding our home. They were there because they'd been told I was a danger. They'd been told I had finally, irrevocably, lost my mind. The truth, as it so often is, was far more complicated and far more painful. But before we get into all that, wherever you might be listening right now, I'd appreciate it if you do an old woman a small favor. Go ahead and click that like button, or maybe leave a comment down below. It doesn't seem like much, but it truly does mean the world to me. The chill from the glass of iced tea in my hand did nothing to soothe the fiery ache blooming on my upper arm. Here, in the soft yellow light of my friend Margaret's kitchen, I should have felt safe, but the phantom pressure of my daughter's grip was a constant, throbbing reminder. I'd pulled the sleeve of my cardigan down, a reflexive gesture of shame, but I could still feel the angry purpled skin beneath the wool. I could still see the scene from dinner playing out behind my eyes. Carol had slid the power of attorney papers across the polished oak of my dining table, her voice as sweet and cloying as honey laced with arsenic. "It's just to make things easier, Mom, so I can help take care of you," she'd said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. But when I shook my head, my voice gentle but firm, telling her I was perfectly fine on my own, something in her expression shifted. Her eyes, the same blue as her father's, went dark and flat. The shove was so unexpected it stole the breath from my lungs, forcing me back into the cushioned depths of David's old armchair. Her fingers clamped down on my arm, not the grip of a concerned daughter, but that of a jailer. "You're just making everything harder," she'd hissed, her face inches from mine. The physical pain was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the brutal shock of the realization. The child I had brought into this world, the little girl I had rocked to sleep, was capable of hurting me. I mumbled some excuse about needing to drop off a book for Margaret, just to escape, just to find a place where I could breathe again. Wade's voice on the phone was like shattered glass. "You can't come back, Grandma. I heard them. I heard Mom and Mark talking after you left. They called the police. They said you have a gun and you're threatening people." A gun? The only firearm in my house was my husband David's old hunting rifle, and it had been locked away in the steel gun safe in the attic since the day he passed. I had never touched it. I didn't even have the key. I tried to soothe him, my words a balm for his panic and my own, but a knot of ice was forming in my stomach. Through Margaret's living room window, I could see the distant pulsating dance of red and blue lights painting the undersides of the old oak trees. They were there. They were at my house. And I knew, even though Wade didn't say it, that his call wasn't just about the lies. He had seen the way I flinched when Carol grabbed me. He had seen the shadow of the bruise on my arm as I'd pulled on my coat to leave. He wasn't just afraid of the lies his mother was telling. He was afraid for my safety. I sat there in the dark of Margaret's guest room, the phone silent in my hand, just staring out the window. The police lights in the distance felt like malevolent fireflies, signaling a deep and terrible rot. My mind, unbidden, drifted back to David. In 40 years of marriage, he had never once raised his voice to me. His hands were for building things, bookshelves, a birdhouse, a life. They were for fixing leaky faucets and for holding me when I cried. I could see him so clearly, sitting in that very armchair, the one Carol had shoved me into, with the Sunday paper spread across his lap, looking up over his reading glasses to give me a slow, easy smile. That house, our house, was built on a foundation of that quiet love, that mutual respect. And now that sanctuary was being violated. The memory of my kind, gentle husband was being tarnished by the very daughter he had adored beyond measure. Carol's accusation wasn't just an attack on me, it was a knife in David's memory. And in that moment, sitting in the borrowed darkness of a friend's home, I knew I had to protect it. I had to protect us both. The next morning, Margaret padded into the kitchen with 2 mugs of steaming coffee. She didn't say anything at first, just set one down in front of me and studied my face, her own etched with worry. "Alex, what's going on? You showed up last night white as a sheet. I heard you pacing all night." Her gaze drifted down to my arm, where the sleeve of my cardigan had ridden up while I slept. "Good Lord, Alex, that bruise." I instinctively yanked the sleeve down, the hot flush of shame rising in my cheeks. "Oh, it's nothing, Marge. Just clumsy me. Walked right into a door frame," I lied. The words tasted bitter, like coffee grounds in my mouth. I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. How could I say those words out loud? How could I admit that my own child, my daughter, had done this to me? It felt like a failure too immense to share, a private humiliation that burned from the inside out. Margaret didn't press, but I saw the doubt lingering in her eyes, and in that quiet, sunlit kitchen, I felt more alone than I had in the flashing chaos of the night before, isolated even from my dearest friend by a secret I couldn't bear to speak. I needed my clothes. I needed my checkbook. I couldn't stay at Margaret's forever, imposing on her kindness, but the thought of returning to my own home, a place that now felt menacing, made my stomach clench. Then I remembered the spare key. I'd given it to Carol years ago for emergencies, a simple convenience that had now twisted into a threat. She had access. She could come and go as she pleased. She had been in my house last night after I'd fled. What had she done? Where had she planted this supposed gun? My first rational thought was to call a locksmith. I had just picked up the phone, my thumb hovering over the contacts, when the back door creaked open. It was Carol, a look of smug satisfaction on her face. "Thinking of going somewhere, Mom?" She strode across the linoleum and snatched the phone from my hand. "What do you think you're doing? You can't lock me out of this house." Her voice was glacial, and for a terrifying second, as she stood between me and the only exit, I was trapped all over again, cornered and helpless. After Carol left, leaving a trail of cold warnings in her wake, I felt myself sinking into a fog of despair. Every avenue of escape seemed to be blocked. I sat at my kitchen table, the morning sun streaming in, feeling utterly hollowed out. On pure instinct, a habit ingrained over decades, I reached over and switched on the small kitchen radio on the windowsill. It was David's habit, really. He'd always listen to the news in the morning while he made toast, but instead of the morning headlines, a familiar steady voice filled the silence. It was an old interview with Oprah Winfrey. She was talking about finding strength in your darkest moments, about resilience. Turn your wounds into wisdom, she said. That voice, so calm and full of earned understanding, cut through the haze of my fear. Wounds. I looked down at the bruised flesh on my arm. Wisdom. I couldn't let Carol do this. I couldn't let her turn me into a victim in my own life story. I was not crazy. I was not helpless. And I would not let her win. After Carol was gone, I stood in my own kitchen and felt like a trespasser. Everything was in its place. My mother's old tea set on the shelf, the refrigerator magnet holding a crayon drawing Wade made in first grade. But the air itself felt different. It was thick with betrayal. I walked through the house, each footstep an effort. My eyes kept snagging on David's armchair, and the phantom ache in my arm flared with the memory. My safe space had been contaminated. I went upstairs and stood before David's gun cabinet. It was still locked, just as it should be. But I knew with a sickening certainty that all it would take was one word from Carol, one official piece of paper, and someone would come with a crowbar and find the evidence she had so carefully arranged. This was no longer my home. It was a trap. It was a stage set for a mad play, and I was the unwilling star. I couldn't use my own phone. I had no idea what Carol and Mark were capable of, what they might be monitoring. Margaret, bless her heart, understood without my having to explain everything. She drove to a convenience store in the next town over and bought me a cheap prepaid phone, the kind teenagers use and discard. For emergencies only, she said, pressing it into my hand with a look that was equal parts worried and fierce. That night, I sat in my car, parked in the empty lot of the closed public library, and dialed Wade's number. He answered on the first ring. For a moment, I didn't say anything, just the sound of my own shaky breath. "Grandma?" he whispered, his voice taut with anxiety. "It's me," I said, my own voice hoarse. "What's happening, Wade? Tell me everything." And he did. He told me about the hushed, angry arguments between his mother and Mark, about whispers of debt, and about a plan to move me to a place where I can get better care. Each word was a tiny, sharp piece of ice piercing my heart. "You have to play the part, Grandma," Wade urged, his voice a frantic whisper over the cheap phone. "Act like you're confused. Don't fight them. Don't argue. I'll try to find something to help." The advice of a 17-year-old boy had become my only lifeline. Play the part. Me, Alexandra Moss, a woman who had built her life on the solid ground of facts and reason, now had to learn to lie to survive. I had to become the very thing Carol was painting me as, a confused, forgetful old woman in need of supervision. The fear inside me multiplied. It wasn't just the fear of being committed against my will, but the immediate physical fear of Carol's reaction if I didn't comply. I remembered the sharp, biting pain of her grip on my arm. My submission wasn't just a strategy, it was self-preservation. I had to turn myself into a puppet so that no one could hurt the real me anymore. The next morning, I drove to Walmart. I walked past the toy aisle, where I bought Wade his first set of Legos, and felt a wave of sadness wash over me. But I wasn't there to reminisce. I went to the stationery section and picked out a simple, blue-covered spiral notebook and a ballpoint pen. It was nothing special, the kind of thing you'd use for a grocery list. For me, it became my arsenal. That night, sitting in my bed under the dim glow of my reading lamp, I began to write. The date, the time, every single incident, the bruise on my arm, Wade's phone call, Carol's words. I documented everything with the dispassionate precision of a librarian cataloging new arrivals. This notebook was my proof of sanity. If the rest of the world was determined to believe I was losing my mind, these pages would know the truth. It became my silent companion, the only witness to my invisible war. During our next clandestine call, Wade whispered a new idea. Mark has this tiny little voice recorder he uses for business ideas. He leaves it on his desk sometimes. A fragile spark of hope flickered to life inside me. "Can you get it?" I asked, holding my breath. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could feel his struggle, the terrible weight of his loyalty being torn in two. "I'll try," he said finally. 2 days later, a small padded envelope arrived at Margaret's house. Inside was the recorder, no bigger than my thumb, along with a hastily scribbled note. "Be careful." I held the small, cool metal object in my palm. It was so light, but it felt like it had the weight to change everything. Wade hadn't just been eavesdropping on a financial scheme. He was confronting the reality of his mother as an abuser. His allegiance had been tested, and he had chosen me. This little device wasn't just a piece of technology, it was proof of my grandson's courage. The morning before Carol was scheduled to come over to talk, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me was a stranger. She looked tired, her eyes bruised with sleeplessness. The lines around her mouth seemed deeper, carved by fear. For a fleeting moment, I considered giving up, calling Carol, telling her I would sign whatever she wanted just to make it all stop. But then my gaze fell to the fading yellow-green stain on my arm. I thought of David's voice, the gentle rumble of it as he'd read to me. And I thought of Wade, my brave grandson risking so much for me. I couldn't fail them. I took a deep, steadying breath. I would not let Carol erase me. I would play the part of the confused old woman, but underneath, Alexandra Moss, the librarian, would be there, quietly gathering her facts, waiting for the right moment to bring them into the light. Carol and Mark arrived at 10 o'clock sharp, not like family visiting, but like auditors conducting an inspection. I'd left the door unlocked. Carol swept in without a hug, her eyes doing a swift clinical scan of my appearance. "You look tired, Mom," she said, her tone a perfect blend of feigned concern and diagnosis. Mark followed, nodding in solemn agreement. I was ready for them. I had purposely worn a worn-out cardigan, left my hair slightly unkempt, and affected a slower, more shuffling gait. I offered them a weak, vacant smile. "Oh, Carol, Mark, I didn't remember you were coming today." The first lie felt thick and foreign in my mouth, but I saw a flicker of satisfaction in Carol's eyes. The play had begun. I was making myself invisible, hollowing myself out so they would believe they had complete control. Carol led me to the living room sofa and pulled out a family photo album. A classic cruel maneuver. "Look at this one, Mom," she said, tapping a photo of David and me on our wedding day. "Do you remember this day?" I looked at my own young, joyful face, and a sharp pain lanced through me. I remembered everything. I remembered the scent of the lilacs in my bouquet, the feel of David's hand, warm and steady in mine. But I had to forget. I squinted, tilting my head. "That's at the church, isn't it? It looks so familiar." Carol shot a look at Mark, a nearly imperceptible nod. "That's right, Mom. You see, your memory isn't what it used to be, but it's okay. We're here to help." They were weaponizing my most cherished memories against me, turning my own past into evidence that I was no longer fit to decide my future. While Carol continued her cruel quiz, I kept my hands busy. I reached for my knitting basket, a habit so familiar to them it went unnoticed. I always knitted when I was anxious, but this time, nestled beneath a ball of soft blue yarn, the tiny voice recorder was already switched on. I placed the basket on the small end table right next to Mark's chair. My heart was a frantic bird beating against my ribs. Every sound, every word would be captured. "You really need to rest, Alex," Mark said, his voice oozing false sympathy. "This Dr. Henderson is top notch. He'll know exactly what to do." Carol chimed in, "We just want what's best for you, Mom." Their venom was wrapped in the language of care, and I prayed the little machine could hear the lie in every syllable. After the memory torture, they moved on to the main event. Mark laid a sheaf of papers on the coffee table. "Now, this is just some standard paperwork, Mom," he said casually, "to help manage your bills, the bank accounts, just to take the burden off you." I glanced down. Even without my reading glasses, I could make out the bold words, "Power of attorney." A wave of nausea rose in my throat. This was it. This was what the entire insane performance was for. I pretended to pick up the document, squinting at the dense text. "So many words. I just can't make sense of it all," I murmured, letting my voice trail off with exhaustion. "That's okay, Mom," Carol cooed, patting my hand. "You just need to sign right here. I'll take care of everything." This is what the loss of agency feels like, I thought. To be treated like a child, incapable and unaware. As I hesitated, pretending to waver, Carol got up and moved behind me, placing her hands on my shoulders. "Don't you worry so much," she said softly. Instantly, before my mind could stop it, my body reacted. I flinched, a small, involuntary recoil born from the memory of her painful grip. It was a tiny movement, but Carol seized upon it. She looked at Mark, then back at me, her face a mask of pity. "You see? You're so jumpy and agitated. Dr. Henderson can help with these panic spells." They had done it. They had successfully twisted my body's natural response to an abuser into a symptom of mental illness. In that moment, a profound despair washed over me. How can you possibly win when your own instincts provide the evidence against you? I looked down at my own hands, the ones that had knitted so many sweaters for Carol when she was a little girl. Now they were trembling, not from age, but from a feeling of utter helplessness. It made me think, those small hobbies we have, knitting or gardening, they aren't just ways to pass the time. They're where we put our love and find our peace. Have you ever used a hobby of yours to get through a difficult time? I'd be so interested to hear about it if you'd like to share in the comments. Before they left, Carol smiled, a brittle thing that didn't reach her eyes. "This weekend, I'll take you to see Dr. Henderson. He's very kind, and afterwards, we'll go get lunch at the Magnolia, okay? You love their salmon." The promise of lunch, such a normal mother-daughter thing, was now a threat. It was the sweet bait on the hook of the trap. They left me alone in the silent house, with the power of attorney papers on the table and the recorder still running silently in my knitting basket. The curtain had fallen on today's performance, but I knew the most terrifying act was yet to come. That night, I waited until the entire neighborhood was cloaked in silence. I sat in David's study, the door firmly closed, and plugged a pair of headphones into the tiny recorder. Taking a deep breath, I pressed play. At first, there was only static and the soft rustle of yarn in the basket. Then I heard my own voice, sounding frail and hesitant, and then Carol's and Mark's voices, sharp and clear as glass. They spoke about me as if I were an object, a problem to be managed. She almost signed, Carol said, and I heard the clink of a glass. Once Henderson gives his sign off, it's a done deal. The whole estate will be under our management. Every word was a razor cut. This wasn't the sound of concern. This was the sound of theft. I played it back again and again, letting their voices burn into my memory. The worst part came from the section recorded after I'd pretended to go lie down for a nap. I heard the distinct pop of a champagne cork, Mark's low laugh, and then Carol's voice, triumphant and cruel. "She won't make a peep," she said, her tone dripping with contempt. "One little push is all it takes to keep her in line." The confession sucked the air from my lungs. She wasn't just admitting to the assault. She was boasting about it. She saw it as an effective tool of control. In that instant, any lingering desperate hope I had for my daughter's love shattered completely. The child I had raised was gone, replaced by this cold, calculating stranger who was willing to hurt me for money. The pain of that realization was worse than any bruise. It was a wound to the soul that I knew would never fully heal. The next morning, I woke not with grief, but with a cold, clear purpose. The tears were gone. The hesitation was gone. The librarian in me had taken over. I took out the blue notebook and divided the pages into sections. Evidence of emotional abuse, evidence of physical abuse, evidence of financial conspiracy. I transcribed the key phrases from the recording, noting the exact timestamps. I dug out old medical bills to prove my history of sound mental health. I took another photo of the bruise on my arm, documenting its fading colors. I worked methodically, meticulously, transforming my pain into undeniable facts. David's study, once my peaceful retreat for reading, had become my war room. I had to copy the recording. I couldn't risk the only piece of hard evidence existing on one tiny, fragile device, but I couldn't go to a normal copy shop. I thought of Wade, but I refused to put him in any more danger. Finally, an idea came to me. Ben, Margaret's son, a quiet computer whiz who sometimes came over to help me with my Wi-Fi. I called Margaret and told her a small white lie, that I needed Ben's help transferring some old family audio files to my computer. Margaret, sensing my urgency, didn't ask questions. She just said he'd be over that afternoon. When Ben arrived, I led him into the study and closed the door. I handed him the recorder. "This isn't old music, Ben," I said, looking him straight in the eye. "This is evidence, and I need your help to make several copies, quietly." Ben looked from me to the recorder, his young face serious. He simply nodded. To gather more ammunition, I drove to my local bank branch. I just wanted a detailed statement of my recent transactions. The teller, Mary, a woman who had known me for 20 years, greeted me with her usual warm smile. But when I made my request, the smile faltered. She typed for a few moments, her brow furrowed. She looked up at me, her expression pained. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Moss," she said, lowering her voice. "Your account has been flagged. It requires a secondary signature for any inquiries or withdrawals. From your authorized representative, your daughter, Carol." The floor seemed to drop out from under me. How? When? It must have been during one of her visits, when she'd had me sign some routine form. They were already a step ahead of me. I felt the blood drain from my face. They weren't just planning, they were executing. The vice was tightening. That evening, Carol called. Her voice was syrupy sweet again. Hi, Mom. Just calling to remind you about your appointment with Dr. Henderson on Friday morning, 9 o'clock. Make sure you wear something nice. Every word was coded. Something nice, so I would look presentable and compliant. A reminder as if I were a forgetful child. I'll be by to pick you up at 8:30. Are you ready? The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Ready? Ready to be taken to a place where I would be judged, labeled, and possibly never allowed to return home from? I looked at the blue notebook on my desk, lying next to the small pile of USB drives Ben had made for me. I'm ready, sweetie, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. Oh, I was ready, just not in the way she thought. Sitting in Carol's car on the way to the clinic, I felt like a prisoner on their way to sentencing. She played classical music, the kind she knew I liked, and chattered about the weather, about the azaleas blooming all over town. It was a grotesque performance of normalcy. She was playing the part of the dutiful daughter, taking her ailing mother to a doctor's appointment. I stared out the window as familiar houses slid past, wondering if this would be the last time I saw them as a free woman. Carol glanced over at me, offering a tight smile. Don't worry, Mom. Dr. Henderson is very nice. He's just going to ask a few simple questions. Her reassurance sounded exactly like a threat. A few simple questions to decide my entire future. I clutched my purse in my lap, the solid rectangle of the blue notebook a small secret comfort. Dr. Henderson's office was in a modern, sterile building. Everything was beige or a pale, washed-out gray, from the walls to the chairs. There were no family photos, not a single living plant, only medical diagrams of the human brain. The air was cold and smelled faintly of antiseptic. As we sat in the waiting room, Carol placed her hand over mine, a public performance for the benefit of the receptionist. It's going to be okay, Mom, she whispered. I looked around at the other people waiting. They were mostly older, some accompanied by their adult children. They looked tired, confused. I wondered how many of them were here because of genuine family concern, and how many were in a trap just like mine. When the nurse called my name, Carol stood up with me. I'll be coming in with my mother, she told the nurse. A statement, not a request. Before we entered the examination room, she pulled me aside, her grip on my elbow surprisingly strong. She leaned in, her voice a low, sharp whisper in my ear. Remember what I told you. Keep your answers simple. Don't try to explain anything. Just let me do the talking. It wasn't advice. It was a command. She was coaching me for my own demise. The script had been written, and I was expected to play my part. A chill traced its way down my spine. I was about to walk into a room where my truth had no currency, where every word I said would be twisted, and where my accuser would be my only spokesperson. Dr. Henderson had a well-practiced, pleasant smile and eyes that were completely devoid of warmth. He shook my hand, his grip limp and brief. He didn't really look at me. He looked at the file Carol had already provided him. Good morning, Mrs. Moss, he said, his tone professionally bland. I understand you've been having some memory issues lately. He stated it as a foregone conclusion, not a question. Carol, sitting beside me, nodded vigorously, her face a mask of sorrow. Yes, doctor, she's been so forgetful and confused, and sometimes her behavior is just so erratic. I sat in silence, feeling like a specimen under a microscope, being discussed by the two scientists who would decide my fate. The doctor's questions were simple, but they were traps. Mrs. Moss, what day of the week is it? What city are we in? Who is the current president? I answered each one correctly, but after every correct answer, he would glance at Carol, who would give a subtle, sorrowful shake of her head, a nonverbal cue that said, "This is one of her lucid moments." Then he asked the loaded question, "Do you ever feel that people are trying to harm you?" There it was, the checkmate question. If I said yes and pointed to my daughter, he would note it down as paranoia. If I said no, I would be denying my own reality. I hesitated, my throat suddenly dry. "Sometimes I get a little confused," I said, choosing the vaguest possible answer. Dr. Henderson nodded, satisfied, and scribbled something in my file. After about 15 minutes of this, Dr. Henderson leaned back in his chair. "Based on what Carol has described and on your presentation today," he said, his voice oozing professional authority, "I believe we're seeing the early stages of cognitive decline. Your agitation and confusion could present a danger to yourself." Carol squeezed my hand, her own hand surprisingly cold. "What should we do, doctor?" she asked, her voice trembling with the manufactured emotion. "For her own safety, doctor," Henderson said, looking directly at Carol, not at me, "I recommend an inpatient stay at a supervised care facility where we can conduct a more thorough evaluation." My heart stopped. A care facility. It was a soft, clean euphemism for being locked away. The trap had sprung. I tried. In a brief pause while Dr. Henderson was making a note, I tried to speak. "Doctor," I began, my voice shaking slightly, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. My daughter—" Instantly, Carol cut me off, her voice thick with fake distress. "You see, doctor, there she goes again. The stories, the accusations. It's so hard to watch." She turned to me, her hand gripping mine. "Mom, please, calm down." Her touch was ice cold. Dr. Henderson looked at me over the top of his glasses, not with inquiry, but with confirmation. He wasn't hearing my words. He was seeing a symptom. My voice had been stolen from me, labeled as delusion before it could even form a coherent sentence. I was utterly and completely invisible. Near the end of the consultation, Carol again placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture that was meant to look comforting. And again, my body betrayed me. I flinched away from her touch, a gut reaction to the memory of her violence. Dr. Henderson saw it. He didn't ask why. He didn't consider the context. He just made a note. Later, when my lawyer finally obtained the report, I saw what he wrote. "Patient exhibits paranoid tendencies, recoiling from the touch of a loved one. Signs of neurosis and persecutory delusion." My body's honest response to abuse had been twisted into the primary evidence of my insanity. It was a perfect, cruel, closed loop. Every attempt I made to defend myself, whether with words or with instinct, was simply more proof that I needed to be locked away. Dr. Henderson tore a sheet from his prescription pad. He didn't hand it to me. He handed it to Carol. "This is a referral to the Rosewood facility," he said. "They are well equipped to care for patients with your mother's condition. I suggest you take her there for admission as soon as possible." Carol accepted the slip of paper as if it were a winning lottery ticket. Her eyes welled with tears as she thanked the doctor profusely. I just sat there, numb. In the space of 30 minutes, my life had been decided for me by a stranger and the daughter who was conspiring against me. That piece of paper, with its illegible doctor's scrawl, felt heavier than a death warrant. It stripped me of my freedom, my dignity, and my right to my own reality. The ride home was shrouded in a heavy, suffocating silence. Carol didn't turn the music back on. She didn't talk about the weather. She had gotten what she wanted at Titoid. She kept glancing at me out of the corner of her eye, not with concern, but with a new wariness, as if I might suddenly lash out at any moment. I stared out the passenger window, but I no longer saw the familiar houses and gardens of my neighborhood. I saw nothing but a blur of gray. I felt like I was trapped inside a glass box, screaming, but no sound was coming out. The world outside continued on its normal course. Cars drove by, people walked their dogs, but my world had just imploded. I had been convicted without a trial, declared incompetent by a system that was supposed to protect me. When we got back to the house, Carol helped me inside, still playing the part of the dutiful daughter to the bitter end. "You just get some rest, Mom," she said, her voice soft. "I'll be back tomorrow to help you pack for Rosewood." The moment the door closed behind her, my legs gave out. I sank into David's armchair, the emptiness inside me a vast, desolate cavern. I had lost. My little play, my secret plan, had failed. I closed my eyes, picturing the sterile white corridors of an institution, and then a vibration from my purse, my prepaid phone, a single text message from Wade. It was only 3 words. I got it. I didn't know what it was, but in the suffocating darkness of my despair, those 3 words glowed like a lit match. It was a tiny, fragile flicker of hope, but it was enough to hold on to. I sat there in the deepening twilight for hours, clutching the cheap plastic phone. I saw 2 paths ahead of me. The first was to surrender, to go to Rosewood, to submit, and to hope that Wade's "it" could somehow save me. But I knew once I was inside those walls, I would be utterly alone. They could medicate me, restrain me, and every protest I made would only be further proof of my illness. The second path was terrifying. It required me to fight back, to trust myself, to trust my grandson, and to face them head on. I thought of David. He was never a fighter, but he never gave up on anything. I thought of Oprah's words on the radio, "Turn your wounds into wisdom." My wounds were raw and bleeding. But maybe the wisdom was in refusing to let someone else write the end of my story. I pushed myself to my feet. My legs were still shaking, but my mind was clear. A decision had been made. I couldn't just call any lawyer from a billboard or a television ad. I needed someone I could trust, or at least someone David had trusted. I rummaged through his old desk in the study and found what I was looking for, his old-fashioned leather-bound address book. I flipped through the yellowed pages, my fingers tracing over the names of men who were long gone, until I found it. Daniel Miller, attorney at law. I vaguely remembered David mentioning him once, a sharp young lawyer who had helped a buddy from his VFW post with some complicated probate issue. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot I had. Using the prepaid phone, I took a deep breath and dialed. The voice on the other end was professional and brisk. I kept my own voice low and steady. "My name is Alexandra Moss. I am David Moss's widow. I need help. It's an emergency." There was a pause. Then the woman's tone softened slightly. "Mr. Miller can see you in an hour." Daniel Miller's office was nothing like Dr. Henderson's clinic. It was warm and lived in, lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and decorated with black and white photographs of local landmarks. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with kind, intelligent eyes that held a quiet patience. He offered me a seat and asked a simple question. "Mrs. Moss, can you please tell me what's happened?" And for the first time, I told the whole story. No acting, no omissions. I told him about Carol's grip, the 3 a.m. phone call, my desperate charade of confusion, about Dr. Henderson and the referral to Rosewood. The words poured out of me in a torrent, as if I was afraid I'd lose my nerve if I stopped. Through it all, Daniel Miller just listened, nodding occasionally, his focus entirely on me. By the time I finished, I was emotionally exhausted, but I also felt a strange, new lightness. When my story trickled to a close, Daniel Miller was quiet for a long moment, just looking at me. I braced myself for skepticism. What proof did I have? I was just an old woman being accused of dementia by her own daughter. But then he spoke, his voice firm and clear. "I believe you, Mrs. Moss." Just 4 words. But those 4 words broke the dam I had so carefully constructed inside myself. The tears I hadn't allowed myself to shed finally came, not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming relief. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, someone looked at me and saw a person, not a patient. "Greed makes people do terrible things," he continued, "but your word alone won't be enough in court. We need irrefutable proof." That's when I told him about the little recorder and the USB drives. Reaching out to Mr. Miller was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. It's not easy to admit you need help, especially when the trouble is inside your own family. But sometimes, trusting your gut and finding a professional can make all the difference. Has there ever been a time you had to make a decision based on intuition alone, and it ended up saving you from a bad situation? I'd love it if you shared that story in the comments. I truly believe we all have a quiet guardian angel inside of us. I arranged to meet Wade at the town park, near the old swing set where I used to push him for hours. He arrived on his bicycle, looking pale and thin, his eyes shadowed with the stress no 17-year-old should ever have to carry. He couldn't quite meet my gaze. Without a word, he pushed a thick manila envelope into my hands. "I'm so sorry, Grandma," he mumbled. "This is not your fault," I said, pulling him into a fierce hug. "You are so brave." Inside the envelope was more than just the voice recorder. There was a stack of papers. Wade had taken pictures of the text and voice messages between Carol and Mark, printouts of emails they had sent to Dr. Henderson, and the most damning piece of all, a copy of a signed contract with a real estate agent to list my house for sale, dated for the week after my scheduled admission. They had planned for every contingency. Back in the safety of the lawyer's office, we spread the new evidence across his wide mahogany desk. Daniel Miller plugged one of the USB drives into his laptop and put on a pair of headphones. I watched his face as he listened. His expression shifted from focused concentration to a deep frown, and finally to a cold, controlled anger. When he took the headphones off, he looked at me. "This is it," he said, his voice grim. "This is the weapon. The admission of assault, the financial conspiracy, the contempt in her voice. It's all here." He then examined the papers from Wade. "And this real estate contract, this shows clear intent. This isn't the action of a concerned child. This is calculated fraud." For the first time in a long time, I felt the scales of power begin to shift. "We're not going to wait for them to make the next move," Daniel Miller said, his voice crackling with a new energy. "We're going on the offensive." He laid out the plan. Step 1. File for an immediate temporary restraining order against Carol and Mark based on the recorded admission of assault. Step 2. Send a formal notice to Dr. Henderson's office requesting all my records and informing them of a pending lawsuit for medical malpractice and conspiracy. Step 3. Freeze all my bank accounts to prevent any further unauthorized activity. They thought they were cornering a frail old woman, Daniel said, a grim smile on his face. They're not going to know what hit them. When I left his office, the afternoon sun was low in the sky, but for me, it felt like the sun was just beginning to rise. The next morning, I didn't wait for Carol to arrive. Instead, a sheriff's deputy arrived at her house. Daniel Miller had arranged everything. The deputy served Carol and Mark with the temporary restraining order and the notice for an emergency court hearing. I wasn't there to see it, of course, but Margaret told me about it later. She'd been out in her garden when she saw the patrol car pull up. She said Carol came out onto the porch and just started screaming. Not the fake, concerned voice I knew, but a raw, furious howl. She yelled that it was all a mistake, that her mother was sick, that this was harassment. But the papers in her hand were undeniable legal fact. For the first time, her story wasn't working. The wind had changed direction. My home phone, the one I hadn't been using, began to ring incessantly. I didn't answer. The answering machine quickly filled with messages from Carol. They started with confusion. "Mom, what is going on?" and quickly escalated to rage. "How could you do this to me? Who put you up to this?" And finally, to threats. "You are going to regret this." Mark left a message too, his voice slick and condescending, saying their lawyer would sort out this little misunderstanding. I listened to all of it, not with fear, but with a strange sense of calm. What I was hearing was the sound of their panic. Their shield, my supposed dementia, was gone, and now they had to face a lucid Alexandra Moss who had the law on her side. Margaret came over that afternoon with a pot of her famous chicken soup. She didn't beat around the bush this time. She sat down across from me at the kitchen table and said, "Alex, I know you didn't walk into a door. Are you ready to tell me the truth?" Looking into the honest, worried eyes of the woman who had been my friend for 30 years, I knew I couldn't lie anymore. So I told her everything, in more detail than I had even told the lawyer. I told her about the shame, about the burden of a mother's love that had kept me silent for so long. When I finished, Margaret didn't say anything. She just reached across the table and took my hand. "You are not alone in this," she said, and this time I let her hold my hand. The wall of isolation I had built around myself finally began to crumble. Daniel Miller was a whirlwind of efficiency. He called to inform me that the bank had received the court order and had frozen all activity on my accounts without my direct in-person signature. He had also sent a sharply worded letter to Dr. Henderson's office. The letter didn't just request my records, it detailed the evidence of the conspiracy and mentioned the legal and ethical consequences of malpractice. Daniel said the doctor's office had called him back almost immediately, their tone shifting from arrogant dismissal to panicked defense. The legal firewall Daniel was building was working. It was not only protecting me, but it was also making the conspirators feel the heat. In the days leading up to the hearing, I forced myself to reclaim my life. I went out into my garden and pulled weeds with a newfound ferocity. I baked a batch of oatmeal cookies, letting the warm, sweet scent chase the lingering chill from my house. I went back to the library, not to hide, but to do the volunteer work I loved, shelving books and helping the children find stories. They still called me Bookworm Alex. These small, ordinary acts were my anchor to myself. They reminded me who I was, separate from being a betrayed mother or a victim. I was Alexandra Moss, a neighbor, a gardener, a librarian, a part of this community, and no one could take that away from me. The day before the hearing, I met with Daniel Miller to prepare. He told me Carol's lawyer had requested a deposition, a formal meeting between both parties. They want to see what we've got, Daniel explained. They still think they can control the narrative, that you're just being manipulated by someone. He coached me to stay calm, to answer only the questions asked, and not to engage in any arguments. Let the evidence speak for itself, he said. And remember, you don't have to act anymore. Just be yourself. Your clarity and your dignity are your most powerful weapons now. I nodded. I was ready. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was overshadowed by something stronger, the resolve to claim justice for myself. The conference room at the opposing lawyer's firm was as cold and impersonal as Dr. Henderson's office. Carol and Mark sat on one side of a long, polished table, a veneer of arrogant confidence plastered on their faces. Carol even managed to produce a sad little smile for me as I walked in. "Mom," she said, as if we were just meeting for coffee. I didn't respond, just took my seat next to Daniel Miller. The air was thick with unspoken tension. Their lawyer, an older man with a smug expression, began the proceedings with a patronizing speech about my unfortunate condition and his client's deep and abiding concern. I let him talk, my hands folded calmly in my lap. When Carol's lawyer had finished his performance, Daniel Miller spoke, his voice calm and even. "Thank you," he said. "Before my client answers any questions, we'd like to present a few items of evidence to clarify the context of the situation." He placed a small portable speaker on the center of the table. Carol and Mark exchanged a confused glance. Daniel looked at me. I gave a slight nod. He pressed play. The static hissed for a second, and then my voice filled the room, sounding frail. Then came Carol's and Mark's voices, sharp and cold, talking about how I almost signed, about gaining control of the whole estate. I watched the color drain from Carol's face. Her composure was beginning to crack. Then the recording reached the most damning part, the pop of the champagne cork, Mark's laugh, and Carol's cruel, triumphant voice. "She won't make a peep. One little push is all it takes to keep her in line." As those words echoed in the dead silent room, time seemed to stop. Carol's lawyer froze, his smug expression melting into one of pure shock. Mark went pale, staring at the speaker as if it were a venomous snake. And Carol, her mouth fell open, a look of naked horror on her face. The mask of the loving daughter had been utterly obliterated. All that was left was the raw, ugly truth. Daniel Miller switched off the recorder. He placed a photograph on the table and slid it across to the opposing lawyer. It was the picture of the dark, ugly bruise on my arm. "Now," Daniel said, his voice like ice, "why don't you tell me about this bruise? Does it have anything to do with the little push we just heard about?" Carol started to stammer. I didn't. It was an accident." But the lie was feeble, pathetic. Daniel continued, laying out the other evidence one piece at a time: the real estate contract, the text messages from Wade. Each document was another nail in the coffin of their deceit. Finally, Carol's lawyer turned to me, all the condescension gone from his voice. "Mrs. Moss," he said, "is there anything you would like to say?" Every eye in the room was on me. This was my moment. I looked directly at Carol, not with anger, but with a sorrow so deep it felt like it had been carved into my bones. "You were my whole world," I said, my voice surprisingly strong. "I spent my life loving you, protecting you. But you didn't just want my money, Carol. You wanted to take my personhood. You wanted to erase me. You wanted to make me a woman with no voice, no memory, no dignity. And that is the one thing I can never, ever forgive." No one spoke. Carol just stared at me, tears finally starting to stream down her face. But they weren't the tears of remorse. They were the tears of someone who had been caught. The deposition ended quickly after that. As Daniel and I walked out of the building and into the bright afternoon sun, I felt exhausted but also incredibly light. The war wasn't over, but the most important battle had been won. The truth was out. I had my voice back. Whatever happened next, I knew I hadn't been silent. I hadn't let them turn me into a ghost in my own life. The court hearing was, in the end, a formality. Presented with the audio recording and the pile of corroborating evidence, the judge didn't deliberate for long. A permanent restraining order was issued. Carol and Mark were forbidden from coming within 500 yards of me. Daniel also informed me that the district attorney's office was now reviewing the case for potential criminal charges of fraud and elder abuse. Dr. Henderson, too, was facing an investigation by the state medical board. Justice, in its slow, methodical way, was being served. I didn't feel a sense of celebration, just a vast, quiet relief, as if a great weight I had been carrying for far too long had finally been lifted. A week later, I was out checking my mail when a car slowed as it passed my house. It was Carol. She rolled down the passenger window. The restraining order meant she couldn't stop, but she could still speak. "This isn't over," she called out, her eyes filled with a venomous rage. All the pretense was gone, leaving only raw, ugly hatred. Her words didn't frighten me anymore. They just made me feel a profound pity for her. She had lost everything, not because of me, but because of the emptiness inside herself. The car sped off, leaving me standing on the curb, certain in the knowledge that I had made the right decision. I thought about it for a long time. This house held so many memories of David, of Carol's childhood, of happy Christmases and quiet summer evenings. But now it also held the memory of betrayal, of fear, of my fight for my own sanity. It was no longer a sanctuary, it was a crime scene. A few days after the final court date, I called a realtor. It wasn't an act of retreat, it was an act of liberation. I needed a new beginning, a place with no ghosts, a place that would be entirely my own. Packing up 40 years of a life is no easy task. Every object tells a story. I found Carol's high school diploma, a Mother's Day card she made me when she was 8. I allowed myself to cry then, weeping for the daughter I had lost, not to death, but to something far worse. But as I sealed the boxes, I was also sealing a chapter of my life. I kept only what truly mattered: David's books, our wedding album, my knitting basket. I was leaving the rest behind. Before I left town, Wade came to see me. He looked better, healthier, but there was still a sadness in his eyes. "Where will you go?" he asked. "Somewhere warm," I said with a small smile, "near the ocean." I handed him a box. Inside were some of David's favorite books and an envelope with the savings I had always kept for his college education. "This isn't a weapon, and it isn't a bribe," I told him, my voice soft. "This is just love, Wade. Love should never have conditions." He hugged me then, a real heartfelt hug, and for the first time in a long time, I felt an embrace that held no agenda, only sincerity. The day I left, Margaret came to see me off. She held me in a long, tight hug. "You call me, you hear?" she said, her eyes misty. I promised I would. As I drove down my familiar street for the last time, I didn't look in the rearview mirror. Ahead of me was the open highway and a wide blue sky. I didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't afraid. I had walked through the storm, not to show off my scars, but to learn that even after the worst rain, there is always a way to find the sun. And I was driving straight towards it. You know, after everything, that long drive towards a new life gave me so much time to think. And I've come to realize that my story, the one I've just shared with you, is about what happens when someone tries to take your voice away and the quiet, steady strength it takes to get it back. I know sometimes when we sit together, the stories just pour out like a river. Today, I wanted to open my heart a little, and I'm also so hopeful that I can hear yours. You know, it's a funny thing about this modern world. A simple click of a button, a like, a subscribe, or a share, it can seem like such a small passing gesture to many. But for me, and for so many quiet voices that need to be heard, each one of those clicks is a little light in the darkness. It's a quiet way of saying, "I see you, I hear you, your story matters." It reminds me that we are not invisible. Just a simple click from you is a powerful declaration of support for me, and the motivation I need to continue sharing these stories. After my story was told, something changed in me. For weeks, all I wanted was for someone to hear me. And now that you have, I realize the one thing I want most is to hear you. Down below, in that comment section, I would be so honored if you would share a piece of your story with me. Tell me about a time you felt unheard. Tell me about a passion that others might have thought was silly. Or tell me about a moment you found your strength in the quietest, smallest of ways. I will read them. I will carry them with me. Because your story, it matters. We want to build Sapphire Revenge as a community where we can share these hidden stories from the bottom of our hearts. I know you will have your own private stories, things that are sometimes hard to share with family or friends. I am here to listen, to share in your joys and sorrows, because we all have the right to be respected and the right to be heard. If you don't have a sad story like the one I've been through, then please share a happy one. Tell me about a small joy you found in your day. Please share it with me. It will be a tremendous source of strength, helping me and the other viewers watching this to heal, to find faith and motivation in our lives. And if you happen to be watching this on a television, please don't hesitate to pick up your phone and look for my channel, Sapphire Revenge. I so hope to share these feelings with you. Let's build a community where we share our true feelings in the most sincere way. Let's make this a place where we truly listen to one another. A place where no woman ever has to feel that her life, her struggles, and her victories are invisible. Thank you once again for sitting here with me. It means more than you'll ever know.